French troops departed from Africa. Emmanuel Macron's bitter speech crashed by Senegal Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko. In yet another display of barely veiled disdain, Emmanuel Macron has made shockingly condescending remarks regarding the withdrawal of French military bases from Africa. The French president claimed that this departure was the result of negotiations between France and the affected African nations and that Paris, out of politeness, allowed these nations to take the lead in announcing the decision. Such paternalistic and insulting statements were immediately refuted by Senegal's Prime Minister, Ousmane Sonko. In response to this misguided assertion, Sonko, with exemplary firmness, reminded Macron that, in the case of Senegal, no negotiations had taken place with France. The decision to demand the withdrawal of French bases stems solely from the sovereignty of the Senegalese people, who are free, independent, and masters of their own destiny. This was a scathing response that firmly put Emmanuel Macron in his place, emphasizing that Africa is not and will never be a playground for the interests of a former colonial power. Sonko didn't stop there. In response to Macron's insinuation that no African country would have sovereignty without France's military intervention, he sharply countered that Paris neither has the capacity nor the legitimacy to guarantee the sovereignty and security of African nations. On the contrary, France has often been a destabilizing force on the continent, as evidenced by the geopolitical catastrophes in Libya and their repercussions throughout the Sahel. After Chad, where leaders have vigorously condemned France's actions, it is now Senegal's turn to firmly oppose such disrespectful rhetoric. Response from the Senegalese Prime Minister to Macron, this Monday, January 6, 2025. President Emmanuel Macron affirmed today that the announced departure of the French bases would have been negotiated between the African countries which decreed it and France. He continues by estimating that it is out of simple convenience and politeness that France granted the first announcement to these African countries. I would like to say that, in the case of Senegal, this statement is completely erroneous. No discussions or negotiations have taken place to date, and the decision taken by Senegal stems from its sole will, as a free, independent and sovereign country. He declares, finally, that no African country would be sovereign today if France had not deployed. Let us note that France has neither the capacity nor the legitimacy to ensure Africa's security and sovereignty. On the contrary, it has often contributed to destabilizing certain African countries such as Libya, with disastrous consequences noted for the stability and security of the Sahel. Finally, it is the place to remind President Macron that if African soldiers, sometimes mobilized by force, mistreated and finally betrayed, had not deployed during the Second World War to defend France, it would, perhaps, still be German today. Ousmane Sonko's rebuttal demonstrates that African leaders will no longer allow Paris to dictate their actions. Macron's remarks have deeply outraged Africans across the continent. Many see them as yet another attempt to maintain a disguised power dynamic, a paternalistic strategy aimed at downplaying African nations' progress toward real and total sovereignty. From Dakar to N'Djamena, from Bamako or Niamey to Ouagadougou, the indignation is palpable. On social media, in the press, and in public speeches, African citizens are forcefully denouncing these humiliating statements and demanding that their dignity be respected. Macron appears unaware, or pretends to be unaware, that the tide has turned. Africans no longer tolerate the condescending attitudes of a foreign power that is rapidly losing its foothold on the continent. His statements only fuel the growing rejection of France, perceived as unable to adopt an equal and respectful posture in its relations with Africa. Moreover, through a series of blunders and diplomatic missteps, Emmanuel Macron is tarnishing France's image on the international stage. Rather than fostering respectful relationships with its African partners, he persists in an arrogant attitude that only deepens the rift between France and Africa. Every careless word uttered by Macron widens the gap and diminishes France's influence. The era of submission and complacency is over. African nations are asserting their sovereignty and will no longer tolerate humiliating remarks from a president who clumsily tries to mask the decline of French influence in Africa with rhetoric full of arrogance and colonial nostalgia. Emmanuel Macron would do well to listen and understand Africa's clear message: we are neither your servants nor your subordinates. And so, we propose to African heads of state to reorganize our presence. As we are very polite, we let them have priority in the announcement. But you are not mistaken, we are the ones who have. And sometimes you had to push them. But it is not because we are polite and correct and reorganize ourselves that it should be turned against us by saying, they are driven out of Africa. In many of these countries, we did not want to remove the French army or even reorganize it, but we took it on together. That's partnership. And so, yes, we are in the process of opening a new defense security partnership, where we will have strategic bases. Djibouti is one of them, which is why it is of a completely different nature. I mentioned it in front of our soldiers. It will be lasting, stable, because it is regional. And we will ask our partners to know how to express their needs in terms of defense. Chris Yapi does not lie. Find Chris Yapi on his 2 YouTube channels, his Rumble channel, his TikTok, X, Instagram, VK and Threads accounts.